are now live.
Awesome. Yeah. Hey guys, thanks everyone for coming. I'm Saneel. I have spent a bit of time in crypto at various funds, protocols, and now kind of just mainly in the researcher, focus more on their own side. And I'm joined by Ivan. If Ivan wants to introduce himself. All right. I guess Ivan will ping him later. But yeah, we're here to kind of talk about the economic motivation for reorgs as they exist on Ethereum today and how to potentially counter those. So yeah. So I don't think many people need this TLDR, but I'll give it anyways. Obviously, a reorg occurs when blocker blocks are part of the canonical chain get replaced by other blocks. Ethereum is currently proof of work and relies on Nakamoto consensus, which is relevant to our conversations because what that means is that one, the ability to mine, is based on computational power and share of hash rate, and two, transactions only have probabilistic finality, which is why time bandits and everything that we talk about here are sort of relevant. And finally, MEV and MEV is the value profit that miners, validators, etc. can extract from the ability to sense and include and order transactions. So, can't deny that MEV is quickly becoming a greater part of total block rewards. This wonderful kind of graph by Flashbots, led by Rob Miller, kind of shows the percentage of fees that MEV makes for in terms of blocks rewards. So, not trying to dance around the elephant in the room, but this also means that MEV can incentivize reorgs, right? So if you're curious about kind of why I went down this rabbit hole and kind of what incentivized this, and maybe around the Twitter drama that really kind of set off, I guess, a lot of these conversations, I kind of detailed the whole chronicle in this article, which should also be in the agenda along with these slides. It goes a little bit more in depth into the story and then some of the solutions, and it has a ton of more relevant links, so would highly recommend checking that out. But this talk is mainly focused on understanding the actual kind of real world scenarios in which reorgs are going to happen on Ethereum as they exist today, and then how to counter them, and then maybe kind of some naive examples of how we can actually quantify and bound these, right? So, one reorg. Well, the incentive for reorgs come when there is significant MEV to be captured in an already mined block, right? So, miner or someone who wants to collaborate with the miner goes and says like, hey, like 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever blocks back, right? M blocks back. I see that there was a ton of value that got captured and I totally missed that. And I really, really want to capture that value. Why don't we go try and attempt a time bandit, right? Which is we go and try and mine on top of blocks before that so that we can go mine that block and capture all the value. Usually, there's not, MEV kind of exists in this kind of like, volatile state, not exactly steady state, but, it's, your very classic liquidations, sandwiching, cross-dex ARB, et cetera, but there are events that do lead to very, very high MEV. And I've listed a few here, but, token snipes, token drops, I think, are definitely one of them. Large position liquidations, which probably are some of the more cogent examples of some of the ones that really have captured attention. So Justin Sun's almost $1 billion liquidation on liquidity is one example. In some senses, makers kind of crisis back in March 2020 could have been another one. And then large asset purchases, right? So, very recent example is someone kind of buying all the floor punks and really, really pumping everything up and establishing a much, much higher floor price, right? Those are all events where there's a lot of MEV to be extracted either through front running, either through capturing the actual value as miner, et cetera, et cetera. And those are events that make a lot of sense for reorgs, which we'll get into in a minute. But there's also factors weighing into a decision to reorg, and much of this comes from both kind of the arbor plus the miner, and they may or may not be the same entity, right? So one, obviously, it's the MEV, like I just mentioned, for the blocks that will be reorged and uncled. It's the expected MEV of future blocks, which impacts whether or not you want to just honestly go mine and kind of what the trade-off of those are, right? It's a percentage share of hash rate because that will impact, the chances that you're actually able to successfully pull off a time bandit, right? And we'll see in a moment that actually is a really big determiner. The cost of renting hash rate, which becomes relevant as we talk about competitors, and so the situation becomes much more complex when you as an individual miner, as a collaborative, as pools collaborating, encounter other collaborators or encounter other competitors that would also like to capture and reorg and want to do that. And then social consensus, which we'll get into a sec. So these factors are very important, but I want to focus on the first three because I think there's a way that we can naively quantify this, and maybe start towards an understanding of when does it make sense to do a reorg, right, in abstract terms. So I will caveat that this kind of situation in this scenario, these calculations were inspired by 0x9116 on Twitter. He did a little bit more simpler version of this with a few more assumptions, but nonetheless, the original thread is great. That's also in the article, so I highly recommend checking that out. But I toyed with some of the assumptions and try to make it more kind of descriptive as possible. So let's just pose a simple scenario, right? Let's say that we are minor, right? And I take minor and abstract as an individual, as a pool, etc. But some sort of entity or group that controls a certain percentage of the hash rate, right? And we look at the rest of the market. So there exists the rest of the miners, right? There exists a block A that we didn't mine, right? Let's say A just passed, right? And that represents kind of the percentage of the hash rate that we have, and is the decimal value. So if n was like 0.5, we would have 50% of the hash rate. X is the MEV, or the rewards in A, right? Aside from the base 2 ETH base reward. And Y is the expected MEV for future blocks, right? And we assume that this is relatively constant for at least the next 2 blocks, 2/8 base block reward. And we only consider the next 2 blocks we can mine. And the reason for that is that if there's a current block being produced on top of A, that's again not ours, right? We can either go in time to mine A and mining the current block. We can attempt to honestly mine on top of A, right, and capture the next 2 blocks. Or we try and mine A, and our A gets uncled to the current block, and it doesn't get included, so we miss on the MEV, right? But we're considering 2 blocks because that's really where we should be concerned, at the very tip of the block. And the assumption that we make here is, one, if we try and time band it, right? So go and mine previous blocks, and someone else mines a block before we can succeed, we revert to honest mining. And the second assumption is that we're the only miner trying to time band it, and I'll get into that in just a second, because that does change a lot of scenarios. But let's just go with these 2 assumptions for now. So first situation is, we decide that we're not going to let greed be the sin that we pick today, and we decide to honestly mine on top of A. So then there's an n times 100% chance of mining the 2 blocks, which are both independent events. More or less, there is some advantage to being the person that mines, then being the one that mines right on top of it. But let's simplify this and assume that they're independent events. So that means that the expected value of each block is the probability times the reward. Reward is 2 base V plus Y, which is all the MEV that we get. So it's n times 4 plus 2Y, right? And that's the EV, and that's what we're kind of referencing when we consider the payoff of trying to time band it. Let's say we do try and time band it, and we decide, hey, I do want to go for this reorg thing, right? Well, there's 3 things that can happen. First, we just don't even get close, right? The next block B is mined on top of A by not us, and we can't really uncle A in the process we were trying. So we don't get to replace A. We don't get to capture that MEV. Someone mined the next block. At this point, we're back to the tip of the chain. So we're just going to try and mine the next 2 blocks on top of B. The chance of this happening is 1 minus n, because n is, again, the percentage of hash rate that you control. 1 minus n is what the rest of the miner set controls, right? So it's just that probability times the original expected value of attempting to mine 2 blocks right on top of the existing chain, right? So that's the EV of that. Situation 2 is we do manage to mine A prime, right, which is our version of A that we want to capture all that MEV that was in A from. But B is actually mined on top of the original A before we can mine B prime, right, on top of our A prime. And so, A prime gets uncle to B in the best case, right? And it gets a 1.75 ETH uncle reward because it's only been 1 block since. That reward decays block by block, but in this case, since it's only 1 block, it's 1.75 ETH. So then, we mined A, it's an uncled block, we get 1.79 ETH, nothing else, and then we try and mine the block on top of B. So the chance of this happening is the probability of us being able to mine A before thing, and then the rest of the market mining B. times the payoff from the uncled block plus the payoff from honestly mining, right? So that's the EV of that, n times 1n, 1 minus n times 1.75 plus n times 2 plus y. And in situation 3, time travel on Ethereum success, we went and stole the MEV in A and B prime. We mined A and B prime. We stole the MEV in A. The probability of this happening is just n squared because it's the probability that we mine both of those before the markets can mine the next one, times the 4eth from the base block rewards from both those blocks plus x, which was the MEV in A. We assume that we just perfectly replicate it, plus y. So with costs excluded, and when I say with costs excluded, I mean the cost of renting and percent of the hash rate, right? We see that this is the bound that we actually get for a reorg to be worth it, right? So I didn't simplify this. You can simplify if you want, but all you need to know is that this can possibly happen, and depending on n, it can actually be a fairly kind of lower bound, right? And like I said, there are events in which this does check out, and this inequality does hold, such as the almost $1 billion liquidity liquidation. But right, we should revisit our assumptions, because I know some people might have been a little irked when I said that let's assume we're the only person in the market trying to do this, right? At the end of the day, the ability to pull off this reorg is actually fairly heavily contingent on the percentage hash rate that we control. So earlier we neglected the cost of acquiring that n percent of the hash rate, but as more hash rate of the total network hash rate is acquired, the EV of attempting a reorg goes up quadratically, and the EV of honest mining also goes up, but only linearly relative to n. And you can kind of see that if you look at the terms in this, right? All of the probabilities relative to n for the reorgs are quadratic. So this means that the incremental kind of benefit you get from renting the next nth percentage of hash rate, right, is going to quadratically scale your expected value for reorgs. Right now, the largest hash rate percentage on Ethereum belongs to Spark Pool. They're around 25-30%. So no one really can go and get to a full 51%. And just who cares about reorgs? We control the network. But earlier we also assumed that no other actors would attempt to time bid it as well. This is in fact a terrible assumption, right? If you do model everyone in the kind of mining market or people colluding with miners as rational agents, and there is this kind of very large profit opportunity sitting on chain, and they don't necessarily care about social consensus or reputation or whatnot, right? You can assume that everyone's going to try and capture this profit opportunity up until a point that it's actually profitable, which also means that there's going to be a rush to acquire hash rate, because as I said, the expected value of attempting to reorg goes up quadratically with hash rate versus linearly with honest mining, right? So we introduce this additional variable that actually affects our EV calculations, right? And it's the cost of acquiring a hash rate. Now, I haven't gotten to kind of precisely model and formulate what this might look like. In my kind of intuition, I think it would end up being some sort of auction to go find hash rate, where the expected behavior is that people are racing to maximize the MEV of reorgs. So that means they're racing to rent and accumulate hash rate. The marginal cost of acquiring hash rate increases because everyone's bidding up on this, and this ultimately reorgs. This eats into reorg profits, and renting platforms extract some of that value, et cetera, et cetera. And the kind of margin that you get on attempting at reorg comes way down, right? Which means that if we revisit this bound, there should actually be an additional term, which is the cost of n, right? And that actually probably ends up being significant, because in a very situational scenario like a reorg, right, you're not going to have the time to go find and fire up your capital equipment and nodes, right, mining nodes and full nodes to actually go and do that, right? So you need to go rent that out really, really quickly. So the cost for increasing hash rate should increase faster if there's more active bidders, right, up until a certain point, at which probably if you assume they're perfectly rational, profit kind of just gets completely eaten up, right? So precise modeling to be done. I hope to kind of one day delve into this when I get the opportunity. But I think it's kind of the basic assumption still holds that this additional cost variable of actually getting to the point where you're maximizing your EV can really eat into your ability, and that's kind of a byproduct of competition. So in the event that you wanted to find hash rate and Ivan will also kind of talk about the dynamics of mining pool and hash rate in the talk after this. You can go to NiceHash. That's really the easiest way to quickly gain hash rate if you wanted to react and reorg, right? The 51% attack cost on NiceHash, or given by 51crypto.com, is about like 1.5, 1.6 million an hour. And you maximize your EV for reorg, obviously at like an amount like or a percentage infinitesimally close to this, so like 50.999. I just said 50 for simplicity's sake. But at a certain point, it just makes sense to go for the 51% attack anyways, right? But luckily, you can't really rent that much amount of hash rate on such short notice through NiceHash, because you can actually only rent about, at the time of this screenshot, around 7% of the hash rate. But usually you can't get to that much, which means even if one of the largest kind of mining pools wanted to go rent enough to get to 50%, they feasibly wouldn't. They would kind of be below 40%. This is all to say that we are all going to make it, right? We're not defenseless against reorgs. As shown here, you can kind of simply and naively quantify kind of what the expected value of reorg is relative to honest mining, right? So if we approximate the reorg EV of a reorg, we can track high-value blocks that can be reorgs. We can track on-chain if block hashes have been changed, right? Which indicates kind of a reorg. That means that we have enough information where we can feasibly launch economic counters to this, right? So there's kind of like two ways to do this, right? You can counter with a payment to not reorg, contingent on block hash being invariant. So Daniel Goldman developed a contract called deorg that basically checks, you can lock up some ETH, checks that a stored block hash has been invariant for a certain number of confirmations, and then pays it out to the miner if it has, which means great, no one reorged that block. You can also extend this a little bit thing. I think Ivan suggested this, but it's kind of like fee smoothing, where it's like you can very slightly, it's extremely similar, modify that to basically pay people to make sure that they mine on top of an existing block. So if I am a miner, right, and I want to make sure that I produce block A, and I want to make sure people build on top of block A, so I keep my ME from block A, I pay a bribe for people, using the same kind of principle as that Daniel Goldman's deorg contract has, where I make a payout if my block hash has not been changed, right? If it has, we know it got reorged. So that's one, right? The kind of softer version of that, but still extremely, extremely important, right? I say soft as in like not necessarily mathematical guarantees, but social accountability, right? It's kind of like the same reason that this was brought up earlier, but Binance didn't decide to reorg Bitcoin for their hack, right? Or why no one's really attempted to go grab 51% of the network, right? There is some element of kind of social consensus where it's like there's an interest in keeping this thing decentralized. And if someone does go for reorg, and we do have active monitoring tools, we can determine which miners have attempted or did reorg Ethereum, right? Which is harmful to their reputation. There's also additional disincentives to miner, right? Where if you compromise ETH L1 security to kind of just snag a few more ETH from this MEV that was in a past block, and that gets out in some sort of twisted narrative, or it's not the best look for ETH, right? So it's like, okay, if ETH security is compromised, that can trigger reflexive downturns in ETH price externally, right? And miners, kind of as the validators for this network, who do get their rewards in ETH, are implicitly long ETH. So it doesn't really make sense for them to go and potentially tank this external markets collapse, right? And finally, like Robert just mentioned, Flashbot's working on tooling to track and disincentivize such harmful behavior, which is obviously great for the ecosystem. So, thank you for coming. I don't know if Ivan was on mic, but he's also going to give a very highly relevant talk to this after. I put our names up there and our Twitter handles. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, this is fantastic. So if you guys have questions, just please drop in the chat and you can answer it in the next session. Sound good?
Yep.